talking until you do. Check 1, 2, and am I there? Hello. Well, I'm here anyway, so I'll keep talking for a bit. Am I up? Have we turned me off? You can turn me on. That's relevant to tonight's topic, isn't it? Yay! Let's give the tech a round of applause. I put a lot of work into tonight, so let's give them another one. Welcome to the GOMA Talks series on contemporary Australia and women. This is, of course, coinciding with the GOMA exhibition on the same topic. And my name is Natasha Mitchell, I'm a science journalist. I also present ABC Radio National's daily morning program called Life Matters. And this is a series of events that you may know Radio National is chairing in partnership with GOMA. And tonight, it's sex and science. I mean, what more is there to life? I'm very excited. Sex, gender, science and society are salacious themes, our ambitious themes, I think. To try and cover these and unravel them in just 1 hour. Whew, wish us luck. But they are themes as old as humanity itself. And I just want to let you know that you can engage in real time tonight. If you're obsessed with Twitter, as half the world seems to be, you can tweet comments and responses. If you could use the hashtag GOMA Talks, #GOMA Talks, it'll pop up on the screen, and we've got little screens, and I'll try and keep an eye on them, although multitasking at this end of the day is a little bit of a challenge. There's also the Facebook page, and we, I believe, have a new SMS facility here at GOMA, and the number for that is 048888 Talks. That's 048888 Talks. Sounds like I'm hosting a radio show. And the tweets will come up on the screen. So, but don't let the whole cyberspace thing distract you. We actually do have real life stars in the flesh, which is novel, I know, but they're going to turn up. And without further ado, let me introduce our guests for tonight. We have Cordelia Fine, Emily Maguire and Christina Lee. Cordelia, come on out. Cordelia Fine is an academic. I might just bring you all out actually. We've got Cordelia Fine, Emily Maguire, Christina Lee and Amanda Third. Now Amanda Third is over here on Skype because she is joining us from Crete. Lucky thing. And so Cordelia Fine is an academic psychologist and writer. Her latest book is called Delusions of Gender, the Real Science Behind Sex Differences, and she is Associate Professor at the Melbourne Business School at the University of Melbourne. Emily Maguire is an acclaimed novelist, and her non-fiction works on sex and gender include Princesses and Porn Stars, Sex, Power, Identity, and it was recently reworked for young women, teenagers, young adults, and it's called Your Skirt's Too Short, Sex, Power and Choice. Christina Lee is Professor of Health Psychology at the University of Queensland, and we just worked out that she's the first woman Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Behavioural Medicine. She's only just realised this. She's an investigator with the landmark 20-year Australian longitudinal study on women's health. She's on the steering committee, and her books include Women's Health, Psychological and Social Perspectives, and the Psychology of Men's Health. So she's got us all covered. And Amanda Third, joining us from Crete. We're wonderful to have you on the line. She's mid-holidays, so we really have to thank her. She's Senior Lecturer in the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of Western Sydney, and she heads up a research program for the Cooperative Research Centre for Young People, Technology and Wellbeing. She's also President of the Cultural Studies Association of Australia. So, welcome. Thank you. I want to throw us all back in a time, pop us in a time machine and take us back to 1879. And I'll read you something that the founder of social psychology, Gustave Le Bon, wrote. Here's what he said. In the most intelligent races, there are a large number of women whose brains are closer in size to those of gorillas than to the most developed male brains. This inferiority is so obvious that no one can contest it for a moment, only its degree is worth discussion. All psychologists who have studied the intelligence of women as well as poets and novelists, recognise today that they represent the most inferior forms of human evolution, and that they are closer to children and savages than to an adult, civilised male. They excel in fickleness, inconstancy, absence of thought and logic, and incapacity to reason. Without doubt, there exist some distinguished women, some, very superior to the average male, but they are as exceptional as the birth of any monstrosity. As, for example, a gorilla with 2 heads. Consequently, we neglect them entirely. Sounds like a comedy script. Panel, have we moved on? Cordelia.
Well, we have to embrace the positive here, yes. We've certainly moved on from those kinds of ideas, but of course there's a thread that's continued through from those kinds of ideas through to today, which is that there are sex differences in the brain, and that by finding them we may be able to explain why we have the levels of sex inequality that we have today. So in the late 19th century, the smaller size of the female brain was seen as, look, we found the reason for females' inferior place in society. Now there's a much more positive spin on it, we're just different rather than inferior. But we're still, looking around at the inequality that still exists in our supposedly egalitarian 21st century and thinking that we might be finding the answers in the brain and the differences between male and female brains. So there's certainly a familiar thread that runs through the science and the understanding of the science implications.
Christina, you're steeped in science as a research psychologist. Have we moved on entirely from Gustave Le Bon?
Well, as Cordelia says, we certainly have, but there is still an assumption that there are essential differences between women and men, that there are essential things that women, by our nature, do better than men. Those are things that are low paid or not paid at all, purely coincidentally. There are still discourses out there of the essential nature of the differences between women and men that serve to disguise the social and cultural impacts on children. What's the first thing you ask when someone has a baby?
Is it a boy or a girl?
Why? Because that's going to determine the rest of their life. Because we treat boys and girls differently, they grow up differently. The differences are still there.
Emily Maguire, what do you think? Have we moved on entirely? I mean, that's a very extreme description.
Well, it is, and we've moved on in the sense that not many people would put it that way now. However, the same kind of attitudes come through. What really struck me is the description of women as being more like children, because that comes through in a lot of the kind of moral panics we get and around things like abortion and discussions, with teenage girls about sexualisation and these kind of things. Even, New South Wales has a ban on women professional boxing for their own good, for their own protection. So all of these things come through all the time, this kind of benevolent sexism, which is usually men deciding that women are too precious and a little bit like children who don't quite know what's good for themselves and how to look after themselves.
I didn't know there was a ban on professional boxing in New South Wales. It reminds me of when I was a kid, the girls at one school I went to in primary school weren't allowed on the football oval during football season, and the principal said to me, well, that's because we don't want your pretty little heads bashed in. And my parents took them to the Equal Opportunity Commission and won. Won out on the oval, girls and boys triumphant in grade 5. Amanda Third, what do you think? Do you think we've moved on? I think this is a question worth asking all of you.
Yeah, look, Natasha, I think it's a really important question. I think the really interesting thing about the quotation that you've just given us is that it evidences the way that science, in a sense, is always culturally embedded. It's always about making sense of the world through the values, attitudes and behaviours that shape our world. So it's not always objective. It's not always scientific in that classic sort of in the way that we expect it to be. I think Le Bon was just one scientist amongst very many of that era who were really convinced that women were fundamentally inferior and also fundamentally irrational, and the science thinking through gender, but I think there's also, we need to pay attention to the kind of legacy that these modes of thinking have for current day society, because as the other panellists members are expressing, they haven't disappeared completely at all. These gendered attitudes persist, and the science is still trying to explain them in ways that justify those differences in many instances.
Hey, Amanda, we've got to fix up your sound a bit, because I think what's happening is your headphones or your mic is tapping against your necklace. So,
would you like me to remove my
indicator, so we might just try and work on that with you. But we've got a question coming from the audience, because we've got this Twitter feed coming as well, and in fact it times very nicely with a question that I was going to ask Cordelia. You've really scrutinised the science of sex differences very closely, interrogated a vast body of literature that makes an attempt to define men and women biologically, and so make conclusions about our behaviour and our capacities to do things in the world. And as part of all that, you've come up with a very 21st century term, and that is neurosexism.
Yes, which has to be combated by neurofeminists, which are a much more dangerous and powerful breed of feminists than the ordinary sort. So.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because you said the day job of taking on gender is rife with occupational hazards. You've said you need a sturdy cardiological constitution and a healthy appreciation of irony. What about neurosexism? What are you getting at when you make that case?
Well, look, when I initially coined the term neurosexism, I was really referring to something very prominent in the popular gender literature, which was essentially gender stereotypes dressed up in neuroscientific finery. So these popular writers who clearly have no understanding of, good understanding of neuroscience and what it can and can't tell us, would just grab some finding from the neuroscientific literature and then construct these enormous rickety bridges from sort of one isolated fact into some sort of educational implication, which teach boys maths this way, girls English this way, completely scientifically unvalidated. It was just, instead of being old-fashioned and sexist, you're now being sort of modern and scientific. But then when I started to look at the literature itself, I began to see that the issues actually start in the scientific literature. And I'm really pleased that a lot of neuroscientists have joined me in criticising the way that popular writers abuse neuroscientific data. But at the same time, I do think the neuroscientific community need to think about the way they commonly practice research do contribute to the problem. So the way that you have lots of small samples that are going to produce a lot of false positive, just chance results, the way there isn't systematic testing of what does it actually mean if you find a sex difference. So for example, the bond was clear that a smaller brain meant an inferior brain. That idea was around a long time before eventually the sort of weight of empirical data forced them to abandon that idea. What we have now is a lot of ideas about what a sort of more active amygdala might mean in terms of cognitive processes, or is it disgust, or is it salience, or is it anything?
What are some of the findings? Let's give some examples here. What are some of the findings that you have particularly contested about male brains and female brains?
Well, the most prominent idea is the idea that the male brain is more lateralised than the female brain, so it tends to be more compartmentalised in the way it processes information. So it might just use one hemisphere for processing language, whereas the female brain would tend to use both hemispheres, and the same for visuospatial processing. And you still see this cited in the literature as a fact, but there have been two sort of overall studies pooling all the available data that overall have found that it doesn't support the idea that male and female brains are processing language information differently. Yet you still see both the scientific community and, of course, the popular literature still asserting this as fact. And then there's a question, well, what would it actually mean? What does it mean to have a waffle brain versus a spaghetti brain? It's really just a speculation. The fact that we don't have this good understanding of what a difference in brain structure or brain function might mean for behaviour means that you can sort of flip around your ideas, and often we'll draw on gender stereotypes to do that. So a researcher called Robin Blum has noticed, she's looking at sex differences in emotion processing, and she's noted that some researchers will find less male activity in a particular region of the frontal lobe, and other group researchers found the same level of activity. A third group of researchers more male activity. Each of these groups of researchers interpreted their findings as showing greater cognitive control of emotions in men. So they're drawing on this stereotype of women as more emotional and men as more rational to interpret these very ambiguous brain data. And it's very similar to what happened 100 years ago.
very similar to what happened 100 years ago. We're repeating the cycle, aren't we? Christina Lee, as a psychologist, you know better than most the kind of just so stories that come from evolutionary psychology. This idea that we behave in ways that are innate, that are part of our evolutionary heritage. And evolutionary psychologists have come up with all sorts of explanations for why women wear lipstick, you know, the assumption that men can read maps better, or why men might be less monogamous and women more, or whatever, all sorts of crazy assumptions that not everyone relates to in terms of their personal lives. What do you make of the whole evolutionary psychology story of the way we are in the world as men and women?
Well, I think it's similar to what Cordita is saying about neuroscience, that it's taking one very small aspect of what makes us a human, which is our evolutionary aspects, and assuming that we can understand something as complex as human behaviour in modern 21st society simply by using that one variable, rather than considering all the other impacts on our behaviour, on our choices, on our decisions, the context in which we live. It's there's an overwhelming wish to simplify and go, that's the answer. Evolutionary psychology has been taken up by pop psychologists in the same way that neuropsych has, and misinterpreted and oversimplified in ways which have been chosen to reflect existing stereotypes about women and men.
For example?
Well, the women can't read maths idea, the men can't do three things at once idea. And if you've ever seen a young man with a selection of iPods and iPhones and so forth, men can do several things at once.
One of the things that I'm interested in terms of the history of the sciences, and I wondered this about psychology too, Christina, is that for a long time, female subjects weren't really experimented on, in a sense. So lab rats were all male because the females had wombs and reproductive cycles, and it was all a bit messy for experiments.
Yes.
So the kind of the status quo for experimental design were male subjects. With what consequences?
One of the consequences has been that women have been ignored. Another is that women have been treated as the other, so that when there is research on gender differences, it tends to be interpreted in terms of how women are different from men, rather than how men are different from women. But another consequence is that it has marginalised and minimised women, but I would argue that it's not good for men either, because although men have been treated as standard human beings, they haven't been considered as gendered beings. There's been no consideration of the discursive construction of masculinity and how that might affect men in ways that restrict or affect their health and well-being. So the idea that gender applies to men as much as it does to women has been a little bit slow to develop. And as we know, men don't live as long as women, men don't lead as healthy lives as women. Men have higher rates of suicide. Men have a lot of problems which one can equate with some of the cultural prescriptions of masculinity. And psychology has been very slow to start to talk about the issues of gender for men.
Do we often see gender, Christina, as a woman's problem?
Yes.
Emily, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The question of the harm that comes to men and boys through gender roles is one that really interests me, and I've spent a lot of time talking about lately, partly because I've written the two non-fiction books that are sort of aimed at young women, and I would really love for boys and young men to read them as well, and some do, and that's fine, but they're kind of focusing on the female side of that. But a lot of people have said, well, why haven't you written about boys and young men? And I often turn that question back and say, well, why haven't you? I mean, we need male leadership in talking about this too, because feminism has kind of taken this question of discussing gender and how much of it is constructed and how much of it isn't, and how are our decisions kind of altered by that or influenced by it. And that has had actually an enormously great influence on men as well. I mean, men of my generation, their relationship with their kids, for example, is so much richer than my father's generation. And in fact, my father's relationship with his grandkids is so much greater than his father's. And that's a direct result of feminism and the movement to break down these kind of stratified gender roles where women do all the kid stuff and men do all the work stuff. However,
is it a direct result of feminism? I mean, it's also men being proactive about their own situation. Did it take women being proactive about their situation to allow that for men?
It's women making that movement. There hasn't actually been yet a kind of a mainstream men's movement in the way that there has been a women's movement that's really, really been so proactive in discussing what is a man, what is masculinity, what are the different roles we can have. There's still enormous pressure. You know, again, a lot of men of my generation would love to have more time with their kids. They would love to take the parental leave. There's still real cultural pressure in their workplace, even if that's legally available to them, to actually take that kind of leave and to have that role. And this is something up to this point that feminism has talked endlessly about, is the work-life balance. But it's only getting halfway there until men all join in that conversation as well.
We've actually talked to young men as part of our research about their plans for the future. And interestingly enough, most of the young men we talk to are very keen on being farmers. Not yet, but in the future they want to be fathers. And as Emily said, they speak about wanting to be involved. They speak about wanting to be actively there. Unfortunately, they still also seem to accept that stereotype that a man has to be the financial provider for his family. So they're, in a way, caught between those two conflicts.
Two expectations.
In the same way that women are caught between all those roles which are expected of young women. So being a young person is not straightforwardly easy for young men.
Of course, things can act against you. I mean, when you look at the kinds of disciplines and professions that men and women tend to go into and the pay disparities in them, you're going to have a sort of structural force that makes it more likely on average that the male will be earning more and makes it harder for the decision for him to take an equal or more active role in the caregiving. So these, you can start off with good intentions and they can come to naught, unfortunately.
I want to go back into that bucket of brains. And before I do that, though, I just want to read a comment that's come from the audience. Well, only women rats have been ignored. I stand for equal rights for all rodents of any species or gender. Amanda Third, you have taken a great interest in one particular woman's brain in history, and that of the brain of Ulrich Meinhof, a German woman. Tell us her story and why you became captivated with what happened to her brain after she died.
Well, I guess the research on Ulrich Meinhof is part of a bigger project around the ways that the female terrorist is constructed as fundamentally irrational. What happened in the case of Meinhof, as the audience may be aware, was that she was imprisoned in the early 70s for participating in terrorism in Germany. And then died whilst in prison in 1976. Unbeknownst to her family and the general public, her brain was actually excised from her skull and then stored informally in a jar in the basement of a university for almost 25 years. And then finally, it was dissected with the intention of trying to understand the workings of the female terrorist brain. I think the female terrorists were bear in mind, this is happening in the late 90s. So this is a kind of a really recent instance of the ways that these ideas about, or scientific ideas about women's fundamental irrationality are playing out. And so for that reason, I guess it was an example that really fascinated me. Because it struck me that actually what we were seeing was a playing out of attitudes that stretch at least as far back as the 19th century, ideas that come out of movements like craniology and phrenology, playing out again in relation to this female terrorist brain that was, assumed would kind of unlock or unleash the workings of this deadly threat to patriarchal order.
Because her brain was seen as a total enigma. And I guess when we think of terrorism, it's confronting, but to think of a female terrorist, what does that confront so particularly in us?
Look, I think on the one hand, it confronts all our attitudes or our beliefs about what a woman should be. A woman should not be violent, a woman should be nurturing, motherly, etc. A woman shouldn't be political. She's, women are conventionally relegated to the domestic realm. They're not supposed to participate in politics, especially not violent politics. So on one level, it kind of, she plays out as kind of, I guess, non-feminine in that she inverts all our attitudes about femininity. But on the other hand, there's something else more complex going on as well, in that she's also kind of playing out as hyper-feminine, because in Western culture, there's a long tradition of thinking about women as fundamentally subversive, evil in nature. This goes back a very long way, but in the late 19th century, it was kind of women were thought to exert a kind of, women were the locus of reproduction. They were thought to exert a downward pull on the noble man who was seeking enlightenment. They kept kind of trying to tempt him back to their realm of fleshy mortality and corrupt him and divert him from the path to enlightenment. So I guess there's, the female terrorist in that she's, configured as evil and subversive, and fundamentally mad, right? She's not a political woman. She's not a political terrorist in the same way a man can be a political terrorist. She's particularly feminine. She's prey to her female passions. She's kind of unable to help herself. Constricted by her biology. So I guess the female terrorist then does two things. She simultaneously disrupts that notion of ideal femininity, but she also confirms this notion of femininity as inevitably subversive.
Yeah, so this idea of an ideal femininity, I struggle with it. I struggle with words like natural. I struggle with words sometimes like biological, depending on the context within which they're used, and ideal femininity. Just before we come to the audience here at GOMA for a question, we're going to split for questions in the middle. Emily Maguire, you'd like to see us judged, for us to see ourselves and to be judged more on the basis of our character than our gender. But surely gender is such a big part of how our character is built and defined.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really can be quite complicated to talk about. I remember when I first started thinking about these issues many years ago in a kind of really lonely, confused sense without any reading and background in feminism as yet. And I was thinking, gender is nothing, it doesn't matter, it's all constructed. And then I would meet people who would say, no, gender is incredibly important to me. And then I, discovered transgender people, some of whom, to the extent that they feel their gender so powerfully that they're willing to go through surgeries and all kinds of upheaval to present as true to the gender they feel themselves to be, which really made me then question that, well, okay, what are we really talking about now? What it comes down to is gender is incredibly important to some people. It is much less so to others. Some people have a far more flexible and relaxed view of their gender than others. The real problem is when the expectations that we put upon people are split in half, and we put half the people on one side and half the people on the other, and we expect this half to act a particular way, and we expect this half to act in another particular way.
But Emily, you've said before that you'd like to destroy all sex and gender-based power differences in our society.
Yeah.
And I wonder, many would argue that that's neither realistic or even desirable. I mean, gender is a part of who we are.
But not destroy gender and not destroy gender presentation or gender identity,
but
destroy power differences based on gender, which is exactly what I'm getting at.
Is it a realistic vision?
Yeah, sure, eventually. Eventually, look, we've come a long way. We've got a long way to go. I do think it's realistic. I think we are getting closer all the time, although sometimes it can feel like we're taking huge steps backwards. I think if you look at how far we've come in 30 or 40 years, we have to acknowledge that there are changes. And I mean, what it keeps coming back to, I think, again and again and again, is this idea that half the population are in one way and half the population are another. I mean, the fact that there are some women who feel incredibly comfortable and even, God forbid I use this word, empowered by fitting perfectly with the feminine stereotypes that society might expect of them. They love that. That's what makes them feel good about themselves.
But it's not
That's not denying that
it's
that's not.
I mean, you'd know that from the young women that you talk to, the girls that you talk to. They'll walk out there in the shortest of skirts, and then they'll, talk about girl power.
Yeah.
And so that conflict is embodied.
So we've got to be careful, because this kind of this burst out sort of a few years ago with the whole kind of panic over raunch culture, which was the idea that girls and young women were presenting in a certain kind of, overtly sexual way, but they were doing it because they were being pressured to do it, because that was what was expected of them. And that was certainly true, to an extent. But the fact remains there are some women who genuinely feel that they are presenting their true, authentic self when they dress or perform or act in a way that everybody else sees as, to use the popular term, pornified. To them, that is their authentic sexuality. Just as some ultra-feminine presenting women, that is their authentic gender expression. The problem is the expectation that one of those things everybody is going to fit into.
Amanda Third.
Look, I think it's really worth just highlighting at this point that our gender is performative, right? It's certainly, and this is not to suggest that gender differences aren't experienced as very real, and that gender differences aren't really about power. And, we can all cite examples in our own lives, I'm sure, in which we have felt the weight of our gender constraining our capacity to do the things that we want to do. But I think the point is that gender is, whilst we might talk about it as kind of oppressive or restrictive, gender is also, I guess, a barrier against that we can play with, that we can experiment with, that we can problematise at a very, very everyday level. Now, I want to be really careful here not to sound like a raving post-feminist, because I really am committed to this idea of, the structural importance of gender. But I think too that as women in our everyday life, and indeed as men in our everyday lives, we're constantly kind of, coming up against this obstacle of gender. And, at certain times we're able to move beyond it. We're able to use it productively to change things. And at other times it's much more difficult to do that. But at all times, there are multiple possibilities. We are not locked in, I wouldn't argue, by our gender. Gender is an invitation to engage, right? With the big question.
I'm going to come back to Christina and Cordelia, but I do want to have an audience question or two, or if you've got questions, and I should have probably warned you that I was going to do this, please participate. Have any questions come up that you'd like us to address as a panel now? The lights are going to go up, and we're going to get, we've got microphones that can come to you. Pop your hands up, and I'll come to you. Any questions, any burning issues that you'd like to raise now? This is a rare opportunity mid-event. What I might do, yes, we've got one up the back, thank you. And if you could keep them fairly focused, thanks.
Why do you feel it is that in certain cultures we would consider to be necessarily not as free, such as communist Vietnam or China, Russia, Eastern Germany, women had the same, a much broader range of roles in society than they seem to have today?
Thank you for that. Panel.
I just can speak to one specific kind of anecdotal thing about that. I've been spending a lot of time lately in Vietnam. I've set a forthcoming book there, and I also worked there for a while, and part of the role I had was working in a publishing house in North Vietnam, editing works that had been translated very formally into English, and these happened to be works just coming out in the last few years from women who had fought in the, as they call it, the American War, for the North Vietnamese side. And their stories are only now being able to come out because certain things have loosened up there. But what was really shocking to me was how much they did during the war, the full roles that they did play, and the rhetoric around that, women hold up half the sky, etc., etc. Women did everything that men did in that war. And then how that was erased very soon afterwards. And if you go to the Women's Museum in Hanoi, there's no representation there of women soldiers. There just isn't. There's some at the prison. There's a few stories of female rebels there in the prison, but in the Women's Museum, the most honoured women are what they call heroic mothers, who are the ones who lost more than 2 sons. And this is starting to change now because things have loosened up, but I did find it really fascinating, and there was a phrase that stuck with my mind, which one of the North Vietnamese generals said when he was kind of in a moment of crisis about how the war was going, which was that this is what it's come to, even the women must fight, as if that was the greatest disgrace. But that was almost a PR thing to be saying, because the women had always fought and they'd always been on those front lines. So even in that society, there's still this kind of one thing being said about women's equality, and then there's still this idea that was somehow a kind of shame that women had to fight alongside the men, and so that was erased in the, when the victors got to write the history of it.
Gee, we're looking forward to that book. I mean, it just says, doesn't it, that there's this beautiful infusion of a discussion here with science, with society, with questions of history, with the present. Chris, Cordelia, the idea that we might be biologically different. Now, you would make the case that scientists are affected by their own values. They're not perhaps as objective as they claim to be, that their own values and experiences and assumptions and stereotypes can affect the sort of questions they ask of their data, and indeed the sort of questions they ask at the outset of their research. But it could be argued that you're resistant to seeing sex differences that are based in our biology. Are you?
Look, not at all. I mean, I actually think the question of how we come to be who we are is, a scientifically fascinating, but of course incredibly complicated one. And I don't think there are reasons to say we should presume a priori that there are different biological predispositions. There are reasons to say we should think a priori that there aren't. I think which way you choose to go is in partly political and partly scientific. I think you can't pull political values completely out of the way that you do scientific research. So certainly it's not that I'm against the idea of trying to understand the role of biological factors or hormonal factors, neuroscientific factors in the development of differences between men and women. What I do object to is the research being done poorly in ways that is very simplistic, that doesn't take full account of the complexity of gender, and in so doing creates a sort of series of poorly supported facts that then rush their way into the popular literature and become lodged in people's minds for decades after their best by date. And one example of this is just referring back to something we mentioned earlier about the fact that women were so often ignored, those poor female rats as well, in medical and scientific research. And one reason for the impetus for looking at sex differences and looking for females in research is to try and redress this imbalance. And that's a very noble aim, but the problem is if it's done in a very unsophisticated way, then you're not actually going to get good scientific knowledge from that. So, for example, if you simply do lots and lots of comparisons of males and females in a very sort of static way, well, one thing you know is you guarantee you'll never produce any data that's going to contradict the idea that those sex differences in the brain might come through different experiences, for example, which of course we know could be the case. If you never actually look for that as a potential factor, you can guarantee you'll never find any data that supports that idea. So that's just one example of ways people are thinking about sex. Perhaps this implicit assumption that there is this sort of universal male-female neural signature is influencing the way research is conducted and then interpreted.
And you've taken on, and we won't go into the detail of the debate, but you've taken on one of the leading researchers on sex differences, Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a famous autism researcher and acclaimed, and you've just gone in horns and horns on this one, and he has developed a hypothesis and attempted to test it, that there are empathising brains and there are systematising brains. One he has described as a more male brain, another a more female brain. You can probably guess which. And in some sense to account for why so many boys have autism, or so many of those who have autism are boys, more to the point. We won't dig into the science, but that has been a big battle for you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate, and I think it's important to distinguish between yes, there are sex differences in instance of autism, but one of the key characteristics of autism is the difficulty in understanding what other people are inferring, what other people are thinking and feeling. It's assumed that there are sex differences in that, and if you give people questionnaires asking how good they are at that, yes, you get sex differences. If you actually give people measures of how good they are, you don't see that sex differences. So you become to see, well, look, there's something going on with autism that's making boys more vulnerable to developing that disorder, having that developmental disorder, but it's not clear that's going to tell us anything useful about sex
Can I ask a question?
developing population.
Christina Lee, I know you've been championing a bit.
Well, I think one of the things that is important to bear in mind is that when you look for sex differences, what you find is differences. While what we know to be the case is that there was far more variability within women and within men than there are between. So you're making a difference that big between two vastly overlapping and differing groups of people. I mean, you and I are extremely different biologically. Nobody's coming up with theories to explain the Natasha-Christina difference.
Now, why is this such a fundamentally important thing to be aware of?
I blame Freud. When in doubt, blame Freud. Freud never understood women. As far as Freud was concerned, this was the big failing of his life. And he said the one question he had never been able to answer was, what do women want? Now, we know why he couldn't answer it, because it's a stupid question. Why would we all want the same thing? But it's based in that idea that we're all the same and we're different from men. And I think if we can get over that and accept that there is a huge variability amongst women, amongst what we want, amongst who we are and where we're going, and that similarly there's a huge variability amongst men. And as Emily said, not to say that this half is for women and this half is for men, but to let us find our authentic selves. We're going to have a lot less distress.
Emily Maguire, do the young girls that you mentor, that you work with, that you do workshops with, do they see themselves, do you think, through the lens of gender?
Yeah, they do. Especially, what's really interesting, I work with and mentor teenage girls, but I actually teach creative writing to little kids starting at age 6. And what I see there is often extreme gender policing. It's obviously not coming from within these kids, it's ideas they've picked up, but then they're very, very concerned with policing that.
Is it hooking into something within them though, do you think?
From the perspective that I see, it is something that comes from, and this is a very creative writing kind of perspective, but what I see coming out in their stories is girls writing characters that are both male and female and that act in a variety of ways, and boys writing characters that are male, pretty much always. And this isn't because they're just natural-born sexists. This is because most early creative writing, but also if you watch kids playing, just in their play and acting things out, is imitations of the stories that they love, so the books and the films that they love. And what you find then is that the mainstream stuff, especially like the Pixar films, which every kid has seen, the main characters are male or male-identified animals or robots or whatever. And girls are very used to putting themselves in that position, identifying, feeling empathy for those characters and expanding it out. And then there's this ghettoised little section of girls' literature and films that have really pink covers and rainbows and butterflies. So, and some of those stories are actually really fantastic. And the girls are getting stories about how they can be heroes and leaders and everything, but the boys aren't touching those stories. So the only examples they're getting are of male heroes and male leaders. And the reason boys aren't touching those pink books is because librarians and parents and teachers aren't giving them to them, or are saying that's girl stuff, and there's a perception that girl stuff is something that boys should be staying away with. So we're actually neglecting boys. We're stopping them from having this full kind of imaginative experience of all kinds of people. And it is through this play and through this kind of fiction at this age that they're learning empathy, they're learning about what the possibilities of different human beings are.
We've got a text here. My teacher told me boys play with boys when I was 6. Joke's on her. Joke's on her, I'm gay. Well, there you go. Christina, you're interested in the transition between girlhood and womanhood.
Yes.
And the way in which gender shapes the decisions, health decisions and beyond, that young women make. How so?
We've been looking for a long time now at the way in which young women move from late teens through their 20s. And we're very aware of the fact that the context in which women have to do this has changed enormously in the past couple of generations. So today's young women are growing up with, in some ways, a lot more freedom to choose, and in some ways a lot more flexibility about their lifestyles, access to contraception, access to freedom of choice about sexual matters is much greater than it used to be. Access to education is taken for granted by young women now, when it wasn't. So much as 1 or 2 generations ago, women simply weren't able to get education and weren't able to move into jobs. One then does come up against something which is a biological fact, which is that there is a limited number of years during which a woman can become a mother. So that for young women today, there is this conflict. It's taking longer to get the education you need to get a job. It's taking longer to make that lifelong commitment to a partner with whom you want to have children, or to decide that that's not what you want to do with your life. And that means that it's taking longer for women to feel they're in a position where they can make decisions about motherhood. And they are coming up against something which is a biological fact, which is that there is a limit there. And that's something which tends when it is explored, to be explored in terms of blaming those women for being selfish and having a good time instead of knuckling down and becoming mums, which is simultaneously seen as the greatest and most wonderful thing they can do. When, in fact, the reason that women are delaying motherhood is more to do with the way in which the context has changed and their highly unselfish desire not to have children until they're in a circumstance where they can look after them. And this is something
if I can interject here, this is really one of the things about, this is one of the problems that feminism confronts.
We're just coming to Amanda Third now. Yes.
Sorry. I just wanted to reiterate some of the points that have been made now. I think that, one of the things that's commonly said is that young women are not embracing feminism in the ways that, women of my generation and older might have. And I think this is really a consequence of the kinds of cultural changes that are taking place that have just been described. I think young women don't confront the limitations of their gender in the same kinds of ways as they used to until much later in life. So rather than being told at age 17, you can't go to university because, that's a man's role, and feeling the weight of their gender at that point in their experience, it's not until things like the time limits on your child-rearing capacities begin to really manifest that you experience the weight of your gender as something that needs to be wholeheartedly challenged and gives rise, if you like, to, or sparks your inner feminist being. So I think that it's not that young women are necessarily disinterested in feminism or that feminism is dying, but rather that the contexts in which we experience gender are changed, and we confront them in different ways today.
Emily, I think you'd like to pick up.
Yeah, it's absolutely true about the, getting kind of later. I didn't start thinking about feminism or calling myself a feminist till my mid-20s exactly for that reason. But I just want to address this idea that young women aren't calling themselves feminists, because it's something I hear a lot. And so many young women are feminists, so many young women call themselves feminists, and young men too. And what's really frustrating is that everyone keeps saying they're not there, and no one's asking them. Everyone's just talking about them. Like, I often get asked to speak as a young feminist, and I'll say, well, you know what, there are feminists who are 10 and 15 years younger than me.
You're an old codger now.
Exactly. And I honestly, with reporters, I've given them names, I've given them phone numbers, and yet again and again we keep hearing there are no young feminists. They're incredibly active, and although certainly, it's a much more, I guess, diverse and even fragmented in a sense movement now, in that young feminists aren't necessarily talking about work-life balance or, having children or those things. There's massive concerns with sexual violence, with relationship violence, with body image, things that are bringing young people into feminism. The other thing is that there's a lot more young men getting involved in the movement now too. And what I'm saying
I think this is a really important point.
Yeah, it's really a divide now, not so much between male and female, or even generational, but a divide between people who now accept that sexism and misogyny are real problems that affect people's lives and those who don't accept that.
Amanda, do you want to pick up there?
I just wanted to say that I totally concur that that young women are stereotyped as not being feminist, and I think it's a real mistake not to recognise the forms of feminist action young people are taking. They are, as Emily's just been pointing out, quite different to the forms of traditional feminist challenge that have been mounted by, women of the radical feminist movement in the 60s and the 70s or whatever. But nonetheless, those attitudes are being challenged. And I think the other thing that Emily's pointing to that's really important to bring home is that young men are beginning to see themselves as part of the solution to this problem. I think this generation, and perhaps it's in part to do with the capacities that new technologies give us, are much more kind of excited about the idea of playing with identity, experimenting with it, challenging it, doing new stuff with it. So I'm really excited. I don't think feminism is dead at all, but I think we need to stop thinking about feminism as a kind of very restricted movement that that is only about women challenging institutional bias or things like that.
Well, I think Emily Emily's described it. There's no such thing as waves of feminism anymore. It's an outdated metaphor. Rather, it's a series of pools, splashes, waterfalls, oases, and pipes. Cordelia Fox, I want to get back to the science in the last few minutes that we've got. What you've done in Delusions of Gender is take on a mammoth body of science, and with what repercussions?
Fame, fortune, panel discussions. It's just been fabulous.
But this became a project. The study of sex differences is a very powerful body of science, and this became a project that sort of overwhelmed you with its scale, and you produced this very interrogative book. But what were the outcomes for you?
Well, one outcome is that I'm continuing the research. In one way, it was in response to what was said in some of the a few of the more critical reviews, which was said, look, okay, there's a few, badly done research studies, but let's not tar the whole discipline with the same brush. And if these feminist criticisms have their way, then we're actually creating the possibility that we might actually not make scientific progress through not investigating what could be a very important influence on the brain.
Fair point.
It is a fair
and
point.
And you had women scientists say that to you too.
That's right. That's right. And I thought, well, look,
differences.
okay, this is an interesting point. It's not my impression. So what I've done is I've actually done a systematic survey of the literature now. I've looked at 2 solid years of functional magnetic resonance imaging studies of sex differences and put those up against a number of matrices of quality, and found no, it's not just a few isolated studies. There's a systematic problem within the literature. And so what I want to do now is go from there to say, well, how can we do better neuroscience of sex gender differences? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm saying we should do it better. And I actually think these worries that feminists like me will do the science damage are completely misguided. I think we could do much better science if they take the criticisms of me and Rebecca Jordan-Young and other scholars. Sorry, it sounds very arrogant, doesn't it? But to think about this topic in a more conceptually sophisticated way is going to produce better science.
So what would a better science look like? Because it's not necessarily about the results it gets. It might get results that surprise you. That's science. That's the way it works.
Absolutely, yeah.
But what would a better science look like?
Well, it would be a science that, to speak very broadly, would take into account the complexity of gender as a developmental history. So instead of thinking of development of sort of being something that goes, it's still stuck in a sort of idea of genes, brain, behaviour with experience, just sort of pushing things one way or the other around the edges. Just that real messy complexity of what development actually is. And that's going to be very difficult to do. It's going to be much more difficult than just putting a bunch of men in a scanner and a bunch of women in a scanner and comparing their brain activation and making up a story about what it might mean psychologically. It's going to be very hard to do. And I'm collaborating with Rebecca Jordan-Young and some others to try and put out
just to clarify, Rebecca Jordan-Young is an American academic who's written a book on the science of gender differences as well.
Yes, a wonderful book called Brainstorm, to try and say, well, how can we do better science? What are the things we have to be careful of as neuroscientists in exploring this issue? What are the responsibilities to neuroscientists, for example, in terms of that interface with the popular literature, for example? Do neuroscientists need to be a bit more responsible, take more of an active role, for example, in addressing misinterpretations and abuses of the science? And, I mean, there are lots of really fascinating questions to do as an academic working in this space.
Christina Lee, as a scientist, what would a better science look like?
I think one of the important things is to acknowledge that science is political and to move away from the idea, the pretense that we are value neutral and above politics, above opinion, that we can somehow divorce our own personal views from what we're doing, and to be perhaps a little more humble about what we bring to our science. I think working with, in social sciences, when you're working with people, seeing that as more of a collaborative process and less of a top-down process is a way in which researchers can perhaps learn things that they didn't expect they were going to.
Well, I think we've got a couple of minutes. We started a little bit late, so I'd like to just allow for a few minutes for questions, if that's okay. So hands up, be brave, and we'll bring a mic to you. Yes, we've got two down the front here, and if you could keep them fairly focused with the question mark, if possible, at the end.
Sure. Okay. My question basically is this, and it comes back to the area of brain sciences and research, and that is with neuroplasticity. It's really hard to come to a conclusion and say, well, brain differences produce gendered behaviour, and we know that a person's life history right from the very beginning influences the development of the brain. So when we actually take a look at a brain, what we're looking at is a person's life history, not just gender behaviour.
Built-in gender, built-in sex, I should say.
Yeah.
Any comments?
Well, absolutely, 100% spot on. That's exactly right. Gender comes into the brain because our gendered experience literally become incorporated. And that's part of the lack of sophistication of the neuroscientific research. And it's really interesting to me that this whole interest in research around neuroplasticity hasn't really penetrated the sex differences.
Yes, it's a great question, I think, because we are constantly in a tango with the world around us, and there's this whole field of epigenetics now which says, that the environment that we're in actually affects what genes get expressed, what genes get turned on and off. So it's this active interplay of nature via nurture, not nature versus nurture anymore. I'm really grateful for that paradigm shift. Another question. Yes, down the front here, thanks.
I've always really seen the idea that you're looking to attract a mate as one of the reasons behind gendered expressions and behaviours. As someone who isn't interested in either gender, romantically or sexually, I've always found this to be pretty weird, and I'm sure there are a lot of lesbians or bisexuals or any other sort of sexuality out there who also think this is a bit strange. How relevant is that still?
Oh, nothing's strange. I have a thought there, Christina. I mean, this is really tapping into the whole evolutionary psychology story about all those just so stories of our brains as they were on the ancient Savannah.
Yes, I think no matter what your sexual orientation, sexual attractiveness, degree of interest in sex, we all grow up in a society which is obsessed with sex, which is obsessed with the commodification of women and the presentation of a particular view of women. And I don't think we can help but be influenced by that, regardless of our own personal preferences. And for some people, there's quite a journey of moving away from that to discovering, again, their own authentic being. For other people, it's like fish not knowing they're swimming in water. They may never actually notice that this is a socially constructed view of what women should look like and what men should look like.
And we've had a tweet from the audience. Growing up, I never felt I fit into either gender definition. Today, I embrace my womanhood and my masculinity and everything in between. So there you go. Maybe that was you, or maybe it's another person feeling an affirmation with you. Up the back there, thanks.
You say that we're not really...
Can you start that again? Thanks.
You say we're not really different to men, but just different to each other. But men can't have children. And you also say that we shouldn't be limited by our gender, but if I was to take a number of months out of my career to give birth to a child,
that would be incredibly limiting to my career. How do you respond to those gender differences?
Amanda Third, did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
You don't know what happened before. Do you mind if I explain what you did before this session? You've just got a newborn who's sort of stage-led. And we had a very amplified breastfeed session going on. Amanda, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Look, I think it's a really, it's not useful to think that we can escape our gender. We can't. These are very deeply ingrained cultural processes. But I don't think this means that we need to be doom and gloom either. I think, in a sense, it gives us an opportunity to challenge. And let's face it, gender isn't the only kind of identity or construction of identity that influences how we think about ourselves, right? There are all sorts of other categories at play every moment of our lives. And I think we need to recognise that at some points we inhabit our gender in particular ways, in some points, we're forced sometimes to inhabit it in different kinds of ways. This is, I think we need to give up on the idea that there is some kind of unified identity. I think we need to understand that we are constantly adapting to our context, putting forward a particular identity in response to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. All our actions are constrained. We are never completely free, and that this is an opportunity to play with those boundaries, to problematise them as often as we can, not to accept them when they don't make us feel comfortable, which is often the case when it comes to gender, but to really I guess actively confront those discrepancies when they appear in our lives, in a way that makes you feel the integrity we seek when we say I am like this or I am like that, right? Rather than an integrity coming from a sense of I'm a woman and therefore I'm like this, you get a sense of integrity from knowing that you are behaving honestly, challenging the things you believe, or challenging the things that you don't believe in, and so on. I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And we've got a tweet here. Why bemoan childhood gender distinctions? Doesn't postmodernism celebrate difference? Final one to Cordelia. Difference does not mean inferiority.
It doesn't, no, and I think it would be very boring if we were all the same. Imagine a room full of myself and I don't want to kill myself. But, of course, when difference is defined along gender lines, then it's more problematic. And I think one thing that's important to touch on is people have talked about, women coming to the idea of needing feminism later on in life and so on and so forth, but there's also a drip, drip, drip effect here. So it's no longer the case that it's sort of, well, look, you can't go to law school, or I'm sorry, you're pregnant now, so you lose your job. We have, sex discrimination laws to stop that kind of thing. But there are these subtle ongoing things, this idea that over time the cultural stereotypes and beliefs are interacting with our own minds are interacting with other people's beliefs, and there's this very gradual, incremental effect that over time causes people, men and women's lives on average, to diverge. And it's a very subtle process. We might not necessarily be aware of it, but it does have an influence. And so I think that's where this idea of difference along gender lines, if we're very talking like on average, of course some men are like this, some are like this, which of course all scientists do. No scientist thinks that all men and women are not overlapping. That's why where I think the problem comes. Of course we celebrate difference, but when you're talking about men and women being different, that has huge implications.
And a final brief comment from Christina and Emily. Christina or Emily? Oh, both. Emily.
Oh yeah, I mean I'm all for difference, and that's kind of my whole point, is that we don't just devolve to one way or the other, and that there's people along the whole spectrum of what we call femininity and masculinity, and people crossing over, and that's exactly what I celebrate and don't want people to be restricted by, and that's definitely something I see being a lot more accepted and acknowledged and celebrated in the younger generation, and it can only be a good thing.
Christina.
I completely agree with that.
So we're in heated agreement.
We're in passionate agreement with each other that there is a need to help people to discover their authentic identity within their gender, but without being limited to a very narrow idea of what's acceptable and what isn't. I think there's a great deal of emotional distress among both women and men who are struggling to try to fit together who they are with something which has come to them externally, which feminism, one of the things that it is doing is freeing people up to be who they want to be.
Well, with that, let's thank Cordelia Fine, Emily Maguire, Christina Lee and Amanda Third.
Thanks, Natasha. I hope you're changing my female.
Special thanks to Amanda Third for joining us from so far away. And thank you for coming out on a Thursday night. I'm really grateful to have had such a packed house, and I know that many of you were outside of the room watching from afar as well, so thank you to that spillover audience. Can I let you know that this will go to air on Monday on Laugh Matters, so tell the friends who weren't able to be here today. We're getting a bit of feedback up on that screen. Oh, and one more thing, just in case you weren't sick of me already, that in a fortnight, the Thursday the 5th of July, my colleague Geraldine Doogue from Saturday Extra will explore business sense, who can make it in the top jobs, a great panel of female business leaders, so spread the word to those who might be interested in that. And you can find out more on the GOMA website, and you can also find out more of when we're going to broadcast on the Radio National website. Thank you.